Mark Twain once said, "Too much of anything is bad, but too much good whiskey is barely enough." And we think he's right. In this episode, we continue our talk with author Lew Bryson. Join me as he shows us just what it means to be a whiskey. Welcome to No Pants During the Pandemic. Hi, I'm Kevin Brooks, and welcome to No Pants During the Pandemic. This time I'm speaking with beer and whiskey writer Lew Bryson. Lew, last time we talked about your new book, Whiskey Masterclass. So why don't we start with a simple but important question. What exactly is a whiskey?
One of the questions we get in whiskey a lot is very similar to a question I got in beer a lot. What's the difference between a Pilsner and a beer? Well, of course, a Pilsner is a beer, so is a porter, so is a stout. Similarly, what's Scotch and what's whiskey? It's all whiskey. Scotch, bourbon, rye, Canadian, Irish, Japanese, craft whiskeys, they're all whiskeys. Whiskey is a drink that's made essentially from beer. You take beer and you distill it. That's pretty simply what it is. It's a fermented grain beverage that is then distilled and aged in wood. Almost always oak. That's largely because oak just makes a really good barrel. It leaks just enough to get the exchange of oxygen that whiskey needs to get a great flavor. It doesn't leak too much, so you don't lose too much of the whiskey over the years. You will lose anywhere from 1 to 10% a year, depending on the climate. You lose more in a hotter climate. So that's all whiskey. But there's some really fascinating differences in whiskeys.
Let's go through some of those differences.
Let's start actually with bourbon, because it's easier to flow that way. It's an American whiskey. It was, invented, developed in the late 1700s, early 1800s. By U.S. law, it has to be at least 51% corn. Some of them go higher than that. The other percentage would be a certain amount of malt, and that's in there largely for enzymes to convert the starches in the grains into sugars for the fermentation. And then either rye or wheat, which are largely in there for flavor. Mostly rye is used, but some whiskeys, Maker's Mark is the best known, use wheat instead of rye. Now, once you've made the bourbon, it has to be aged in a new charred oak container. And when they say new, that essentially just means you can only use the barrel once for bourbon. Charred literally means when they're making the barrel, they get the body of the barrel set up without the heads on either end, and they put it over a gas flame. Actually, some of the smaller coopers are doing what traditionally was done, which is building a fire with scraps of wood in the middle. You char the inside of the barrel, and that does a couple of things. One, it creates charcoal, which is a fantastic filter, so it's pulling some of the stuff out that you don't want in the whiskey. And it also creates what's called the red layer in the oak. Oak is full of sugars and flavors. It is also full of compounds that slowly break down under the influence of alcohol or oxygen and create other flavors. So the charring is an essential step.
And it's the time in the charred barrels that turns the bourbon brown, because it starts clear, right?
Yeah. I mean, this is only 2 years old. I don't know if you can really see that. Yeah, there you can. You can see how dark that is. That's only 2 years old. That's what 2 years in a new charred oak barrel will do. So that's one huge family of whiskeys. And then rye is essentially the same as bourbon, except it has to be at least 51% rye. Otherwise, everything else is the same. Then, because you have all these used barrels, they reuse them. They send them to Scotland. They send them to Canada. They send them to Ireland. They also send them to people who make tequila and cognac, because you can still use that barrel to age spirits. So what happens is you get to Scotland. In Scotland, there are two main types of whiskey. There's malt whiskey and there's grain whiskey. Malt whiskey is the stuff that we think of as Scotch, usually made from 100% malt. The malt is sometimes smoked over peat, but not all. You ferment from that, you distill in those pot stills, and then it goes into used barrels. Usually these days those are bourbon barrels. There's also a small but significant amount of sherry casks that are used. There's some finishing where they'll fully mature a whiskey in either bourbon or sherry casks and then finish it for an additional few months or maybe even a couple of years in a port pipe or a Madeira cask or any number of other strong sweet wines to give a variety of flavors. But then grain whiskey, you ferment a variety of grains, a lot of corn, a lot of wheat, some malt, and then distill them through a column still. Essentially, beer comes in the top, it drips down through plates with holes in them, steam comes up from the bottom and strips the alcohol off, and it goes out the top. That's a really rough explanation and doesn't go into the detail it deserves, but the important thing to know about that is you get a much higher percentage of alcohol off of it. I mean, it's coming off anywhere between 160 and 190 proof. So, 80 to 95% alcohol. But then you cut it down with water and put it in a barrel and you age it for at least 3 years. Scotch has to be at least 3 years old to be legally called whiskey. So you've got this aged high proof whiskey and then you've got this aged single malt whiskey. And that's the other category of Scotch when you blend those two. These are whiskeys like Johnny Walker, J&B, Dewar's, Famous Grouse, Ballantine's, you get the picture. These are blended Scotches. Blended whiskeys range from the cheap stuff that you're drinking with soda all the way up to some really amazing blended whiskeys. Well, Johnny Walker Blue, for one. I'm rather fond of one called the Antiquary. Just really good whiskey. Irish runs much the same way, except there's a different type of Irish called single pot still. Single pot still has a mixed mash bill with malt and raw barley. Gives it a much different flavor, has a really green, fresh flavor to it with a lot of fruit. Also aged in used barrels, although some of the Irish distillers are starting to experiment with new charred oak themselves.
How about Canadian?
Almost all Canadian whiskey by volume, the major brands, are much like blended Scotch. They're a mixture of pot-stilled, what they call flavor whiskey, and column-stilled blending whiskey. Japanese, largely the same as Scotch. There are some subtle but important differences in how things are fermented and distilled. And then craft whiskeys, where all bets are off. Anything can happen as long as they follow the basic rules. So you've got things like millet whiskey, triticale whiskey, wheat whiskey that's over 51% wheat. All these different grains people are trying. There's a popcorn whiskey that's made. Whiskey made from popcorn rather than field corn. All kinds of experimentation going on. Some of them are crap, some of them are good. All of them are kind of interesting and different. One of the more interesting ones that I've seen recently, Few Spirits out of Evanston, Illinois, actually just won an award with a whiskey they call Cold Cut. When you bring a whiskey out of a barrel, you cut it with water to bring it down to the bottling proof. Like for an 86 proof whiskey, you've got it coming out of the barrel at say 130 proof. You cut it down to 86. Well, instead of cutting with water, Few for this cold cut, they used cold brew coffee. So it's a very different flavor, especially because there's no added sugar. Usually when you think of a coffee liquor, you think of a coffee liqueur with added sugar. Doesn't have that. This is the kind of stuff that the craft distillers are doing. Really, really interesting things.
Has there been like a destination or a region that's just blown your mind?
Wow. I traveled to Scotland, Ireland, and Kentucky, mostly, for whiskey travels. I have to say, all three of them are just fantastic places. Scotland, every time I go, still, I've lost track of how many times I've been there now. I just always find something wonderful and beautiful there. We actually took a family vacation there about 3 years ago and rented a car, drove up out of Edinburgh to Balmoral Castle, and got out of there and just kind of we literally went about a quarter mile down the road, down the highway, and saw it turning onto a small road and just went off. And for 20 miles we were on this single track road, and right at the end of it, boom, there across the field was Glenlivet. I'd been to Glenlivet 3 or 4 times before, never came on it from that direction. It was a whole new thing. It was very cool. The neat thing about Scotland, and I guess Scotland is what I'm saying is the place that really blows my mind. The neat thing about Scotland is there's so many distilleries. I think it is the densest concentration of distilleries in the world, especially right in what they call Speyside, along the River Spey. The Spey is the longest river in Scotland. It's a little over 100 miles, which in America would be laughable, but it's just a gorgeous spot. Beautiful concentration of distilleries along there because of the water. There are warehouses everywhere. That's where Forsyths, where they make the stills. I've been in there as well. That's where they're located. Speyside Cooperage. I'm not sure if they are the largest cooperage in the world, but they're immense, making and repairing barrels. Just all kinds of things along there. Great, great area, and I would highly recommend going there. Kentucky is pretty awesome these days. When I first started going there, it was maybe a little depressing because some of the old distilleries were looking kind of ramshackle because things weren't good. They weren't selling a lot of whiskey and they weren't making a lot of money, and maintenance was low on the list. Nowadays, they're rolling in it. They have gorgeous new visitor centers. Even the new small distilleries. Please, I don't know if you've come across this brand, Rabbit Hole in Louisville. Amazing place. The distillery was built for touring. It's gorgeous, beautiful. A lot of that going on. People are putting money into that end of it, and I really hope a lot of that survives what the hell we're going through now.
How would you compare the beer enthusiasts versus the whiskey enthusiasts, or I guess beer geeks versus whiskey enthusiasts?
It's going to be interesting for a beer geek to hear this, but whiskey geeks are even more argumentative about details than beer geeks are. I remember being interviewed by someone from the Village Voice. It's got to be 8 or 9 years ago now. But in the middle of the interview, she said, "Can we go off the record a second?" Sure. Said, for my job, I have to read a lot of blogs and websites to keep up with what people are saying and thinking. I'm like, okay. She said, why are whiskey people so angry? And I had to laugh, but I had to agree. There's some real anger out there. There is an assumption that distillers are always lying to you. People are really angry about allocation. I mean, the Pappy Van Winkle thing is large. You can't find it. It's hundreds of dollars a bottle in the secondary market. But the same thing goes for a lot of different whiskeys. There are limited edition scotches out there that are that go for a lot of money, and you just can't find them. You'll get something like 190 bottles for the world. Now, obviously, you aren't going to get that, and yet there is some kind of weird entitlement going on that thinks I should be able to get any bottle I want, and it shouldn't cost more than $100. That's just unreasonable. I mean, beer geeks nowadays look pretty calm and collected by comparison. There's a lot more cooperation with them. People wait in line and they're happy. The only whiskey people I've seen waiting in line that were happy were the people who were lined up for the Stranahan Snowflake releases in Denver. I mean, people camp out for over a week waiting to be in line for that. They flew me out there to take part in it this past December. And I literally saw people sleeping with frost on their sleeping bags. It was so cold. And yet they're all happy. And they're not happy because they're drunk, which is the normal assumption. People are like, oh, whoa. No, it was camaraderie. That was kind of weird to see because a lot of times whiskey people will be waiting in line and they're not happy at all. They want to get at that stuff and go home and flip it on eBay. Not eBay anymore, no, whatever the hell they flip it on. I don't know what causes that. Maybe it's because it's more money. Maybe it's because things are even more rare than, a $30 4-pack release in beer. But yeah, I think the whiskey people tend to hoard more because they can. Whiskey doesn't really go bad, even after you open it. So I think that tends to lead to more hoarding. I don't know. I just don't think that's good. I don't think it's good for the industry. I don't think it's good for the people. I'm kind of hoping that some of this may get battered around a bit by the pandemic and people start drinking their bunker, as they put it. So they call it when they buy case after case of their favorite whiskey because it might water out or it might get more expensive. Well, it is running out and it is getting more expensive because you're buying it 2 cases at a time. Duh.
I've been enjoying, the beer geeks who hoard their stuff, and as the trends have changed, now they're hoarding IPAs, and
Yes!
or specifically like New England. I'm like, how are you going to be able to drink those 3 cases, in the week before it goes bad?
Yeah, or blows up.
I had the pleasure of selling Cantillon for a decade.
Oh, right.
The Cantillon people are fantastic. The Vanois family, they're lovely. But there's just not enough of the beer to go around.
Yeah.
And back to the entitlement thing, everybody just feels like they're entitled to it. And it's like the United States could have taken every drop they made.
Yeah.
And there still wouldn't have been enough.
And they're just sure that you're lying to them. Or that somebody else is getting it and they're, well, yeah, somebody else is getting it and you're not.
The irony, of course, is if we actually had enough, then nobody would want it.
Of course. Right.
Any real characters you've met, and this could be for the either beer or whiskey, any characters you've met over the years?
One of my favorite people in the industry is one of the first people I met in whiskey, Jimmy Russell. He's the master distiller at Wild Turkey. Jimmy's literally has been working at Wild Turkey longer than I've been alive, and as you can see, I'm not young. He started working at Wild Turkey in 1954. He's still working at Wild Turkey. Doesn't go in every day, but no, actually I think he may go in every day. He's largely a ambassador at this point, but he's still got an office in the distillery, and there's still a pretty good chance of finding him in there. Jimmy's son, Eddie, is pretty much the everyday master distiller at Wild Turkey. Eddie's been there, I guess, over 35 years now. I remember having a conversation with him. He's like, yeah, I can't retire until Dad does. It just wouldn't look right. I said, but I'm really starting to think about it. They're a great pair. I really like interviewing them. I like talking to them. Bill Samuels Jr. at Maker's Mark. He's retired now, largely, but he's still very much in the business. Bill's a special friend because he got me into the Kentucky Colonels, and I appreciate that. Thank you, Bill, if you happen to be seeing this. But Bill was just a larger-than-life, flamboyant, crazy man. And yet the man gives the most thoughtful, interesting interviews. He's one of the best in the industry for it because he's always thinking ahead. And he's the guy to talk to if you want to know where things are probably headed. Scotch whiskey, Bill Lumsden, who was actually the inspiration for my new book. It was something he happened to say when I was interviewing him that set me off on the whole thing. Bill is a damn genius. He's been behind a lot of the innovation for the entire industry in the past 20 years. Innovation in grain, in yeast, that's practically an unknown area for innovation in Scotch whiskey. He's the master blender for Glenmorangie and Ardbeg, one of the first 2 distilleries to do any kind of barrel finishes. Just a great guy, a lot of fun, and has an incredible store of really, really filthy jokes as well. I remember sitting up late nights with him after Whiskey Fest in New York and just laughing till we hurt with these just terribly foul jokes delivered in a curdled Scottish accent.
What about beer people?
More beer people than I can name. You mentioned Tom Peters earlier. I have learned an amazing amount from Tom. Learned about beer and learned about life as well. Great guy. Sam Calgiani said years ago that, this is an industry that's pretty much 99% asshole free. I love that about this, and it's true of whiskey as well.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Lew. Thanks for spending all this time with me.
Kevin, it was a pleasure. Thank you very much for doing this. I feel like I got out of the house.
Bye, Lew. If you'd like to learn more about Lew's work, head over to his website. And if you're interested in buying either Whiskey Masterclass or Tasting Whiskey, the links are in the video's description. Thanks for watching. Cheers.